I'll tell you an interesting story. I remember coming to London and I remember seeing Anthony. I always fantasized of thinking one day I'm going to be in Anthony's camp, and Anthony's wife would joke that, you know, me and Anthony should move in together and they should move in together. It wasn't until he tried to kiss me one night in the club, and I remember feeling the stubble, and I would sort of turn up maybe with a bit of a sort of a
eyeliner,
or I remember having a bit of a burgundy wedge. It was more glamour, it was the 80s, it was big hair, it was highlight. There was an experimental thing that went on with it all. Sitting on a board in a room of very, very big brains. I was like, what the am I looking at here? Like, this is... But I remember it like it was yesterday, and I think I'll always say that. I say this to young hairdressers now that I work with, that, you know, you always applied for a job, and I then got sent to Australia. It was all done in avant-garde and really weird, and there's a place for that when there's, without a doubt. I would take all rules out of it, you know, because I can do it. I can braid, I can do all of them things on a set with Rankin. I would be fired.
Nick Irwin, game changer.
God, that is a really tough question. I need a wig. Can we hold it right there?
Nick Irwin, former global creative director of Bedhead, one of the most iconic hair care brands of the 21st century. You was there right up through its metaphoric rise until it eventually sold to Unilever for an eye-watering 411 million. Now, just take me back to that last year before Bedhead sold. What was Bedhead World like?
I mean, I suppose you can compare it like it was playing for Chelsea. I mean, I think it was, at that time, we were such a powerhouse. And I think one of the things I always say to people is that we never really were aware of what everybody else was doing. We were so dialed into what we were doing as a brand, as a culture, almost as a cult, really, in the way that we did things, that we were just really at a point where we felt to take it any further, the brothers thought to take it any further, we needed to sell the company on. It needed to then be bought by a conglomerate, a corporate organisation that could then achieve the sort of vision that we had for it on a much bigger scale.
And do you think they did that?
Unfortunately, no. I think at the time, you know, and I was privy to a lot of pre-acquisition meetings and what the, you know, with Unilever when they were interested in buying, and it was a really interesting time because I think we were, and I don't think Anthony or the brothers would mind me saying this, I think we were very, it was quite a romanticized kind of way of the way that they talked to us about, you know, the vision and where they could take it. And I think for us really at the time, we dreamed of being on TV and commercials and really taking it to a whole different level, more to the consumer. Even though we always said we would stay professional, we just wanted that bigger sort of wider adulation, if you like, with the brand. And you know, I think Unilever, I think intentionally when they came in and bought the organisation, thought they could do that. I think they tried to keep us all at the helm and keep the mechanics of it sort of ticking away. But I think the fact that once they bought the company and Anthony had became you know, he sat on the side, if you like, in terms of not necessarily, I mean, he was a consultant to the company. So I think once he'd lost that sort of, I don't even know if the power is the right word.
The leader.
They'd lost the leadership of what he did. And, you know, and the reins were handed over to me. I mean, I was sold on as part of that acquisition. And it took a little while for that transition to happen, and I became the global creative director. So that was a weird time. I mean, I think, you know, once that had sort of happened, it was tricky. But going back to your question about pre-acquisition, it was a really exciting time because we were throwing everything at the kind of that final year of really trying to make the brand even sexier and blow it up for it to get it to that point where Unilever, signed the deal.
Because I went down to the Bedhead Studios a few times, where you had that lovely little restaurant next door that you all used to hang out, and it did feel like this Studio 54. I mean, how many shows was you doing for Bedhead a year?
Well, that was the thing with us. The way we were set up on a global level, we had distributors around the world that were all connected to the brand, that were all kind of shareholders in the business to an extent. So each market, when we would go to places, it was quite heavily policed by us on a creative level as well. I mean, everything had to come through what we were doing out of that space that you saw in Battersea in London. So that small studio space that Anthony and Pat took on when they demerged from Tony and Guy in 2003, became the sort of the nucleus, the kind of the sort of, like you say, the Andy Warhol factory, we used to call it, of sort of hair, because what we created it wasn't just a sort of a place where you could come and see us do hair or whatever, but we would create the image, the marketing, and it was on the cuff of when digital was starting to just come through. Anthony had stopped shooting film and everything went digital, which opened up a whole gateway for us of how we could get images across the Atlantic to Bruno in America really fast. So with all of that, with the image, and Anthony always would talk about, image was king for us. I think he'd learnt all of that at his days as obviously at the helm of Tony and Guy. But for us, it was how do we marry the image and the creativity and the education behind that, but give it to the people that buy into the product line. So you buy into the products and you're buying into a cult, if you like, a regime of how we function as a creative. And the hairdressers, our clients, were unbelievably loyal. And it was incredible. It was, we would travel the world and we would do, I think we were doing, something in the excess of about 40 or 50 shows a year, which was just phenomenal at one point.
We
were on the road.
Big shows, weren't they?
We were big shows. We were doing shows in Vegas to 5,000-6,000 an audience. We'd do them, here in London, where, we'd do the Grosvenor, or we'd do really, I remember you coming to quite a few of those shows. The great ones that we would do that always stuck in my mind were Bologna. We would do Cosmoprof, which in them days, we would rent this space, the car park space, and we'd build this auditorium. And we would do sometimes 3 shows a day to 2,000 people at a time, and sold out, completely sold out. So it was, it was like being in a rock band. It was like being in U2, and it was an exciting, sexy time for us.
And tell me this, as an art team, was you aware of the business and the money, or was you all focused on the hair, the creative, the campaigns?
That's a really good question, because I think at Tony and Guy, my role in them days was purely to focus creatively on the hair and be part of that juggernaut of what Tony and Guy was and still is as a creative, and that's a global artistic team. When Bedhead, when Anthony and Pat sort of demerged from what they were doing with Tony and Guy and set up the studios and went into partnership with Guy and Bruno.
And how big was it then?
Well, the company then was, I think, it was a much smaller business. I think we were turning over 80 million plus in them days. To take it from what it was to 410 million when we sold the organisation was a pretty phenomenal growth. But I think what was interesting was that Anthony's vision of not replicating what we did at Tony and Guy, because there was areas that wouldn't have worked as a product company. I think we were always about trying to embrace the hairdresser and make the hairdresser give them the pedestal to feel like they're number one. I think when you're educating at the likes of Tony and Guy and Sassoons, there's that element of being taught and mentored and your work being broken down. It can be demoralizing. We had a very different perspective on teaching. We always would embrace all the great stuff and make people feel like $1 million that would come through our academies or schools that we had around the world. So it was a different mindset. And that doesn't mean that we weren't disciplined in the way that we worked, but we had a very different way of approaching the hairdresser. And that really stemmed, I think, from Anthony's personality. Anthony is one of those, anybody who knows Anthony Mascolo, is that he, and did it to me as a young hairdresser, but got a great skill. It's a great gift that he has, where he can touch everybody from a first day apprentice
makes people feel good.
Absolutely makes people feel good. And I think that kind of rubbed off on us as a team, and that became part of the sort of ethos of the brand.
And like a family.
And a family. And I think that, you know, the family being Italian, I think there was you would come to the restaurant. We did so many deals in that restaurant at Ransom's Dock, and we wanted the way that Anthony and Pat, and it was very incestuous, you know, we lived and breathed, and we were very much part of that whole journey together. But we wanted to extend that out to people that would come in. So if people were interested in joining the company or buying into the product line, we wanted them to feel empowered in that part of what we were doing. It was a very special, unique situation, and something that I don't think had ever happened before us, and I'm not quite sure whether it would ever happen again like that.
What did you love most about your role at Bedhead?
I think that what was great was the freedom. I think Anthony was, you know, we'd even though we never really had strong job descriptions, I think at the time when I'd sort of left Tony and Guy and gone into session work, and then was sort of approached by Anthony to say, look, why don't you come back and maybe consider doing this again with us? We've got a smaller situation. We're going to build it with what Bruno and Guy are doing in America, and we'll see where it takes us. What was really interesting, I think at the time, was Anthony really sort of stepping back from doing as much hair. He went very heavily into shooting more, became the sort of, even though he would always put his blessing and his DNA over the images that we were creating, he really gave me the reins creatively, and it allowed me. So in all of my career up until that point, I'd never felt, there'd always been certain things that would hold me back. You know, whether it would be you have to work a certain way because it was part of the system at Tony and Guy, or whoever you'd worked for in a salon before that. Anthony freed all that up. He really, I think there was a trust. And I think also bringing the sort of fashion thing in that I'd maybe learned a bit in doing session work, and marrying that with obviously what we were doing as a professional hair brand, trying to fuse the two things together really helped us, or certainly helped me sort of become the creative that I am today.
How did you get that gig? I mean, what do you think Anthony saw in you?
Well, Anthony, it's a mad thing with Anthony because, you know, I'd worked at Tony and Guy for a long time, and my first sort of real, and it's funny because I think it was round about the time we met in Australia in the mid-90s. It was the mid-90s, right? Was it 96 or 97? I can't remember.
God, it's
it was
like
all
25 years ago.
I know, it was a blur. But I'd worked for the company for a number of years, but it wasn't until we did this event in Australia there was a bonding thing happening.
That event?
Yes, because Gary was there, Sasha was there, myself, Anthony.
I remember it well. I remember us all being
we were all
Australia,
together,
yeah.
and I think, and it was just a really special event. And I think something happened. The kind of the chemistry, and I think when I came back, when I ended up coming back, I was living in Australia at the time. When I moved back to London, my relationship with Anthony became way beyond just being a hairdresser working for him. We had very similar, you know, passion for food, passion for music, passion for fashion, for photography, for all of the stuff that it was very, very similar kind of. So we had this real connection between each other. And I think it created a bit of situation sometimes at Tony and Guy, because maybe I was sort of seen as his golden boy a little bit from time to time, looking back. But when I knew things were changing towards the end of the 90s, and I knew that that Anthony would potentially move at some point over to Tigi. I was aware of some of these conversations. And I think in my head, I always probably had a bit of a dream of how it could potentially look if we were to do something together. Anthony made that happen when he set up the Bedhead Studios and gave me the reins as creative, if you like, to doing hair. And then from there, build the team. You know, we were responsible to then empower what we were doing with the Americans and bring them in. And that's how we created the Tigi International Creative Team. And
tell me this, because when it eventually sold to Unilever for 411 million, I mean, who says you can't make any money in hair, right?
Absolutely.
You know, it must have been a double-edged sword for you, because, you know, on one hand, you must have been very proud that you was part of this enormous thing, and the Muscola families, you know, what they got out of it. But on the other hand, you kind of lost your dream job. I mean, how did you feel back then?
I think it was an interesting time because there was this nervous energy of what's the future going to hold for us. Is it going to become so corporate that we're going to hate it and not understand the culture and eventually it's all going to fall apart? Or is it going to be something that we can embrace, and all of the things that we talked about taking the brand to a whole different level and having the sort of financial support and all of those things that Unilever hopefully would have brought to the acquisition, to the ownership of the company. And I think also for me to then expand and go beyond what I was doing for Anthony was also exciting, but it was nerve-wracking. There's no doubt about it. And I think we all did at the time. I think there was people around the world that didn't take it great, found it very, very difficult to deal with, that family-owned situation where you could pick up the phone and speak to Bruno or Guy or Anthony or whoever it was, senior leaders in the company. There was an open door policy that was very, very unique to that company. That really overnight changed once the new owners came in. And I think Unilever tried to come in and listen. 4 out of 5 acquisitions fail, and I think that's which is unreal really when you think about it. But I think at the time they really were very respectful of keeping Anthony there at the helm in terms of he was a consultant to the company and keeping his DNA as part of the brand. And then eventually sort of helping myself and the team become more empowered by being a creative organisation that would then also have a seat sitting on the board. And I sat on the board of directors as a shareholder and as a creative.
What did you miss most about those days?
I mean, lots of things. I think that the big thing would be, the first and foremost thing, to put any of the work thing aside, would be the family thing that we had. There was a very unique sweet spot where we went on holiday together and we broke bread together. It was just, we practically, both Pat and Stacey, my wife, and Anthony's wife would joke that, me and Anthony should move in together and they should move in together. We were practically living, because we lived around the corner in the apartment, and it was just a really unique, special time. And this was, pre my daughter being born, and we had fun, and it was an incredible time. So that I miss immensely. And I think also, the great thing, I don't want it to ever feel, because I think it can get ugly when people were part of something and then sort of are disrespectful to it. There was always going to be great elements of things and great parts of it that you really embrace and parts that you want to maybe forget. But I'm a glass half full guy. I've never been I'm a realist, and I always want things to, I always want to see the best in things. And I think when Unilever bought the company and learning all of that stuff that I was sort of exposed to as being part of their senior leadership team and sitting on the board of directors, was a whole different scope of things that I never thought I'd ever got involved in.
Kid from north of England.
Kid from the north of England, who was starting in very humble beginnings as a hairdresser, and fast forward 25, 30 years, 28 years later, and here I am. Here I was at the time, sitting on a board in a room of very, very big brains. I mean, really smart, intelligent people. Corporate business people, but that really respected the creative microphone that I was given, that was representing the brand on a global level. And that's really what my role was. It was being at the helm and leading the team, having Anthony as the confidant, being able to go to him and really get his blessing on everything. So never trying to fill his shoes. That was one thing and I'll always say that to anybody. It was never about, the guy is just the guru and created a culture. He created a whole, a sort of very, very unique creative situation, Anthony. And I think, so it was never about trying to take over from that and fulfill those shoes, but certainly trying to come in from a new perspective of the way that maybe Unilever wanted to kind of slowly fuse the company into a slightly different direction. So an exciting time. It really was, and I think, and it led me, funny enough, going, and I maybe we'll come on to this, but it led me then connecting again with Rankin in a kind of roundabout way, and then ended up sort of, you know, becoming what I'm doing now, obviously working with him and working with, obviously, you know, session stylists, but doing other things. So there was a lot came out of it that was super, super positive.
Right, I want to take you right back now, right back to when you first started in the early years. You know, you came from Carlisle, a working class background, on the Scottish border, right? What did your mates think about you when you said you wanted to do hair?
So I grew up in a quite you know, and I hope the people from that part of the world won't get upset if they see this, but it was a rough little town, a little city. You know, I was like any other teenager in the 80s growing up, where, you know, it was getting into trouble was just part of who we were and whatever. So my mates were all quite laddish. I think I always had an obsession for music, and I think that thing with music, eventually when it led me into through my father being a drummer, and had a connection with a hairdresser who then took me on as an apprentice. But I think my mates at the time, I think, were very, you know, they really gave me a hard time. They were like, you know, what, oh yeah, big time. And really, I went.
For how long?
I kept it a bit of a secret. I was working on a Saturday, and I think what happened was, in the 80s, at that time, there was a sort of fashion that there was this. We were casuals, and we'd wear, you know, Kappa tracksuits. We'd have the kind of wedge haircuts. It was the Farrahs, all of that stuff. It was all. So I would, but of course you do, because we're a similar age. But what happened was that slowly I would probably start to dress a little bit more flamboyant. You know, and I talk about this a lot.
This New Romantic time, was it?
Yeah, there was a New Romantic thing that was on the back of New Romantics, but there was a club in Carlisle, which was a student night on a Wednesday night, called the Twisted Wheel, and it was a melting pot of goths, punks, skinheads, New Romantic. I mean, it was just the place that you could go and be, you know, a misfit for the night. It was where we could go and just do whatever you wanted, and it was a creative kind of playground for us. So I used to go there with a guy who I looked up to immensely, a gay hairdresser who I worked with in the salon, and I think, you know, looking back, you know, and I'm open about this, even though I'm a heterosexual, you know, man.
But you was unsure at the time.
Yeah, I was unsure. Yeah. I was unsure, and I think I was. It wasn't until he tried to kiss me one night in the club, and I remember feeling the stubble, and I thought, that's just not for me. And it made me realise. But I think most boys would never admit it. But I think there's always the curiosity of, and certainly when you're thrust into this beautiful world of theatre and of flamboyancy and being able, and beauty, and you can be who you want to be. You can celebrate your sexual orientation. I mean, all of your diversity, inclusivity. It was just this magic light bulb moment for me, where I just thought, this is it. This is going to be me for the rest of my life.
How long did you keep it a secret from your mates?
Probably for a good 6 months, where I was working on a Saturday and I didn't keep them. But I think all of a sudden, when we go out on a Saturday night, and I would sort of turn up maybe with a bit of a sort of a eyeliner, or I remember having a bit of a burgundy wedge, and they were like, "What's?" And I said, "Well, I'm working in a salon." And I think there was the joking and the piss taking and all of that stuff at the beginning. But I think once they realised what I was being exposed to, and when I was in the club, and some of those cool hairdressers and girls and clients that were coming over, they realised that actually, hold on a minute,
your gang.
this is where it's at. And I actually converted a few of my mates. They ended up coming to work in the salon we worked at. So it was a great time, but a brilliant time, and a very early age. Even before I left school, I knew that this was going to be my career. This was going to be the job that.
What were the benefits to being a male hairdresser, do you think?
I think at that time, well, it's interesting, because I think there was, being a male straight hairdresser, there was a lot of gay male hairdressers in the industry, and I think the industry had this perception that you had to be gay to be a male hairdresser in hairdressing. But I think for me, it was at that age of 14, you know, teenager discovering, you know, your sort of, you know, your sexual encounters and being part of that whole, as everybody goes through as a teenager, that whole thing of it just was a really, I think hairdressing just enabled and helped you embrace that stuff a lot easier. And it exposed you to things, you know, being hanging around older people or people that I thought were older, you know, even though it was only 2 or 3 years older, they felt a lot older than me because I was 14. I was being sneaked into nightclubs and dressing a certain way. And it was almost like you had this sort of other character, that you were this other person.
So you was working in the north of England to begin with, right? Was there any inspirational people or moments that kind of drove you on in those early days?
Well, I'll tell you an interesting story, because I remember it like it was. I remember coming to London in about 87, I think it might have been. I always get my years mixed up a little bit. And I remember seeing Anthony and the team do a show at Wembley, Salon International at Wembley, on stage. And I think up until that point of seeing them, hairdressing to me was more glamour, it was the 80s, it was big hair, it was highlights, it was, you know, the new romantic, there was experimental thing that went on with it all, but the salon work was quite classic, and but seeing those guys and seeing Anthony at the time, I remember them doing this whole show with Catherine Hamnet clothes, this military stuff. They brought these kind of pram wheels with these screens on, and they were projecting images onto it, and it was like, I was like, what the fuck am I looking at here? Like, this is, and they looked like the coolest kids on the block, like all in cool outfits, on stage, cutting hair, and it all felt very punk in the way that they were working. Not punk as in more Mohicans and
but the attitude. But
the attitude behind it, the anarchistic approach, the flipping it on its head. That was a light bulb moment for me. That without a doubt, you know, was the time when, because the north of England, you know, going to that club was my little sanctuary, and my time of that was my fantasy. You would lay in bed thinking, wonder what it's like when listening to music and listening to, you know, whoever it might be you were into at the time, and fantasizing what London might be like and what the clubs are like and what the culture is and all of this stuff. Seeing that and seeing accents on stage, seeing Trevor Sharp, who's from Manchester, seeing another guy who's from Leeds, seeing blah, blah, blah. All of these characters, and then Anthony at the forefront, who looked unbelievable. Long hair, Catherine Hamnet suit on. I mean, just looked...
Always been a cool dude.
Always cool.
Even now at 17.
Absolutely. I mean, he's incredible, really, to think about, you know, how he's
I want to be like him when I
grow
up.
So do I. And I think, but I remember it like it was yesterday, and I think, you know, I'll always say that, I say this to young hairdressers now that I work with, that, you know, you always idolize, like become a fan and manifest your idol. Because for me, I became obsessed with Anthony. At that point, you know, I wanted to look like him, I wanted to dress like him, I wanted to talk like him, I wanted to do hair like him. He became I'm not saying that I became sort of like a stalker, but I was very, very...
So tell me this, you see Anthony on stage and the Bedhead team and you're blown away.
Tony and Guy team at the time.
Tony and Guy team, right? And you're a young kid from the north of England, you go, I want to work with them. How does a kid from North England make that happen?
Well, them days was a really tricky thing, Lee. It was a tough one because you had to apply for a role, you had to VARDA. And VARDing, which is the thing that Sassoons obviously had made famous, where you went in and you know, that was so anybody who doesn't understand VARDing is a program where you have to complete a certain amount of haircuts to a certain standard until you're allowed to even work for the organisation. So it doesn't matter where you've worked, what you've learned, you've got to learn the new philosophy, the new way of working, and that what Tony Guy's way of working. So that was the first thing that was always really scary.
So you applied for a job then?
So I applied for a job, and I think once I then got sent to Australia, and I think what was really interesting.
Why did they send you to Australia?
Well, because there's a chap called Dennis Langford who bless his heart passed away recently in Australia, who set up Tony Guy Australia in the mid-90s. But he was in charge of the beginners school at St Christopher's Place, and I did an interview with him and was talks about, potentially wanting to go to Australia. And then we went out to Australia early because the salon was meant to open early and it didn't. So we ended up working with other people. I ended up working with another hairdresser out there while we were waiting for the salon to open. But I think what was interesting was that really was a way, because Tony & Guy was such a tight, it was like Led Zeppelin. You were in that band was going nowhere. To try and penetrate that, it was almost impossible. And I think going out, for me, it wasn't a way of fast tracking it, but it was a way of probably trying to be exposed and going up the ladder a little bit quicker in that part of the world to hopefully get recognized by Anthony or whoever it was to then come back into the team.
How did you stand out? This huge company, all these creatives, how did you stand out and get noticed?
I think it was my obsession and I still hold that today. I think it was my obsession, my dying passion for wanting to learn everything. They had a very strong philosophy. I really lived and breathed it. And I think that in itself, and then also trying to put your own, even though it was a very strong kind of tight system, they also encouraged you when you got to art director level to then start to sort of bring in your own influences on things, the way you talked, the way you dressed, the way you held yourself, because that would then influence the team at a higher level. And a slightly different intelligence came into the team, a creative intelligence is probably a good way of describing it. So I bought into all of that stuff. I think all of that stuff that cultures us as a kid, that stuff from the club up in the north of England and being around all of that stuff and being a sponge and reading all the magazines from The Face and ID and all that stuff that was really, you really just dreamt that you wanted to be in that world.
Was you a natural, Nick, or did you have to really work at it?
I don't want to sound facetious, but I think everything came quite easily to me. I think there were certain things that I sort of hated perming. If I say perming was the thing that I never really got my head around. But I could colour, I could do all of that stuff, but really when I went to Tony & Guy, you had to make the decision. You had to become a cutter or a colourist. There was no in between. It was 50-50. It was separated down the middle. That's how the salons were set up.
And of course, cutters were kings back then.
Cutters were kings back then, and I think that was but then to become a part of the artistic team, you then had to do your art director's test, and with the art director's test went way beyond cutting hair. The Guido was there at the time in the 90s, so there was all of that stuff that was coming off what he was doing in the early 90s from the runway, and they were creating their own sort of culture and some of the hair that they were doing and the photographers that they were working with.
Was this before grunge, was it?
This was all around about the same period that was starting to sort of bubble up, and I know Guido spoke about that. I think that whole thing really heavily influenced us as a creative team, having him connected to it. And
how was he connected?
Well, I think Anthony was very brilliant. I mean, again, the sort of the Pied Piper, the smart guy that saw the brilliance in him and early on and thought having that connection to him being on a retainer and being part of the organisation was our connection to fashion. Was our connection out of any other hairdressing brand. We were connected. We could authentically say we are connected to that world because Guido's part of what we're doing. So it really paved the way for a lot of people. There was other hairdressers, session workers that were affiliated with other product companies, but not necessarily to an organisation like Tony & Guy. And he very much played a big part with the creative team. They were going with assist and shows and all of that. So that all got sort of fed into the kind of pot, if you like, the creative pot that was really starting to sort of fuse the image of Tony & Guy. And then that married with Anthony's photography of capturing all those incredible collections. If you think back to those early collections of the Transient collection, in the early 90s and the timing of it when the crash had happened and those haircuts all looked grown out, so you didn't have to visit your hairdresser every 6 weeks to have a fresh haircut. It was all longer layered, superfluous layers, and it could be razored or just ingenious ways of working. And also the touch. I think the touch that Anthony had, I always want to talk about this stuff because I talk about it to this day, that I studied that thing that he did to hair. That was, people thought you cut hair a magical way. It didn't necessarily, it was never really just about that. It was about how we finished those cuts, how we touched them, how they looked on camera, how they looked on a stage in front of 1,000 people on a big screen. That movement, that texture, that feeling, that lived-in thing. And that ethos, that nuance, that aesthetic came from the session world. Without a doubt, because we were doing hair that we felt the public really wanted to look like. Not competition hair, not hair that was all done in avant-garde and really weird. And there's a place for that without a doubt. But at the time, we wanted to really connect the hairdresser and the consumer together. And that's how Toni & Guy really built its name and reputation.
So you talk about Anthony and about, kind of worshipping him, like as a guru and a mentor. And John Frieda spoke very, very similar about Leonard. Yeah. He worshipped him.
Yes, he did.
In the early days. Why do you think it's so important to find that mentor, that guru, and stick to him like glue?
Well, I think without it, I think it's like anything. I think without it, if you speak to any sports person or artist, or everybody has somebody that they need, that they're mentored by or they're super influenced by. And it'll go for every major session worker, you name it. And I think the reason for that is that to have that person in your sights allows you to work towards that. It gives you a purpose. It makes you really, I think it disciplines you. It makes you kind of really heavily research how they've got to that point. And I think following the success of that, looking at how they've got to that point, that journey that's taken them to that, will help you get to where you want to get. I think that's a really valid point. I would like to say I was strategic of going to Australia, and I always fantasized of thinking one day I'm going to be in Anthony's camp, I'm going to be his right-hand man, I'm going to work. And I really heavily pushed that. I didn't force myself on them. I made myself noticeable and connected with him on a personal level. But I think that would be the best advice I gave to anybody. I go through a situation now as a session stylist where my assistants, I always tell them that it's super, super important to really manifest the person that you want to be. You need to really understand if it's a Eugene or a Guido or a Duffy or whoever it might be. Really study what it is about them that you love, the DNA, the aesthetic, the nuance, all of those things, and then start to work towards that. It'll give you success. It might not give you exactly the same amount of success as what they've got, but it'll certainly help you on your way.
Yeah, it's like reach for the stars, and if you don't quite hit them, you'll still get covered.
Absolutely,
in stardust,
100%.
Right? So what were the three biggest things you learned from Anthony?
I think, the one big thing which really has helped me now to where the point I'm at in my career now is art and commerce. And that's the first thing I'll always say with Anthony, because you can't have all the creative, beautiful stuff without the business funding it. You can be creative as you want, and you don't need a lot of money to be creative, but to really put that to take it on a global level, and really, you have to understand the art and commerce of how all that comes together, fusing the salon business and what we were doing as a creative team and putting that together, and then pushing it out to the industry on a global level. So that was probably the biggest learning. Even now to this day, with what I do in the session world and what I do when I'm working with brands, with corporate organizations, having that knowledge, that understanding, having the creative taste and aesthetic, which, is a certain level, but understanding that how the business needs to get to a point to be able to make that work is invaluable. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I think, was empowering hairdressers, about always giving, being there for people and giving people, inspiring the next generation. It's something that I live by. It's very much part of who I am, and anybody who knows my history knows that I've always been behind that. I always say that if I was never given that opportunity by him, or him seeing something in me at that young age, all those years ago in the 90s, I wouldn't be where I am today. And that's always stuck in my mind. And I think I want to give that opportunity to other younger hairdressers, to help them grow and become what they want to be, or help them along the way. And I think thirdly, the most important, and I said, I think all of them are really important, but thirdly, a very important aspect of it is family. Being around him and himself and his brothers and understanding how they were together, being around him, him and his children and we were all one big family, really helped me become a better father, a better husband. And I think that, so those are the three pivotal things that I've learned from him and I've told him a million times. I mean, he's very aware of that.
So you obviously mixed business with pleasure with Bedhead, and do you still think that works today?
Well, I know where you're going with this, and I think it very much was the climate. I think, we the lifestyle that we were doing and having fun and all of that stuff fueled the attitude.
And the culture, right?
And the culture.
I mean, I don't think it would have had that energy.
No, it didn't.
If you didn't have that family, that, business and pleasure aspect of it.
Absolutely, Lee. I think that the climate, the timing of it all, it was about excess and having fun and partying and all of that stuff that went with it, and it gave you a swagger. It carried on from the 90s. There was a whole scene happening on a global level wherever we went. We were into. I think it was about enjoying ourselves. I think it was about sharing that enjoyment with people. About and maybe looking back on it, there was an element of things that you think maybe we shouldn't have done and whatever. But
what shouldn't you have done?
Well, maybe we partied a bit too hard from time to time. I mean,
didn't we all in the 90s?
Absolutely, and I think we did. I think and I think. I don't know, as you get older, you do get a bit nostalgic. You do look back on things and you think that certain things happened, and would that relationship have stayed as good if we weren't, doing what we were doing? And I don't have any regrets. I mean, absolutely not. And I think going back to the question about, the attitude behind it, it fueled what we were doing. It was part of the culture and it helped us get where we got. And I think that thing I talk about of, going right back to the 80s, of seeing them on stage and that punk thing, that attitude carried right through the 90s. It came and it manifested into partying and the lifestyle and being who we were and buy into it. It became part of who we were.
So tell me this. So Bedhead sold and you went onto the board, and no doubt you had a big salary, big corporate salary, first class travel wherever you went. And you, all of a sudden, you went from being this creative to on the board with all them sort of opportunities in business. Why didn't that kind of pan out for you at Unilever?
Well, it's interesting because I think initially when they acquired the company, there was a transition. There was a good 2-year transition period where we had sort of the new team, if you like, that had come in, that were looking after the business and the marketing. Unilever split it right down the middle. You've got business on one side and the marketing on the other, and they sit equal to each other, which is very, very much a corporate system. But very much for them, it was 50-50. My area as a creative sat under marketing. But also, I had a sort of an unwritten direct line back into the business of what we were doing. So, in order for them to sort of get my work level right, and it's all about work levels in corporate organisations, they had to give me a fairly high work level, and what came with that was responsibilities of the corporate structure. So, for instance, sitting on the board, and but my role was really to have the creative microphone for the business. So all of the learnings, all of the intel that I was getting fed through from my team on a global level when we were traveling, the clients, you name it, was being brought into to boardroom level, right from the horse's mouth.
And did you like the boardroom
loved it.
And the business?
Loved it, absolutely loved it.
Why did you love it,
I think because I think I'd been exposed to the business with Anthony more than I had, Anthony and Bruno and Guy, more than I'd ever had when I was working at Tony and Guy. And I'd started to learn the ropes and understand, like I keep saying, the art and commerce. When you're in that arena, you're in with the big boys, it's a whole different level. It's a different language, it's a different way of working. And I'm a sponge, I'm obsessive. So, and I, whether it's being creative, whether it's music, whether it's, whatever I'm into it. and it became my life. And I suppose it was like going back to school. It was starting to brush off the academic things that I'd probably forgotten about when I was a teenager or when I was still at school. And I wasn't saying I was hugely academic, but I was fairly bright. And drawing on some of that early stuff that you learn. And a lot of it is common sense. A lot of it, when you're in that arena, in that sort of, in that room of those really big brain guys. And don't forget, you've got people around that table that are running the finance of the company, supply chain, markets. I mean, it's all the movers and shakers.
Sales, operations.
Absolutely, and you know that. You've gone through this as well, Lee. But it turned me on. I loved it. What started to happen was that then, equally while that was happening, the marketing department had this bright idea that they wanted me to really own Catwalk. They had a brand that was separate to Bedhead called Catwalk.
I thought that was Tigi.
Was Tigi,
Tigi. Same thing, isn't it?
Tigi, same thing.
And isn't that with Tony and Guy now?
No. It was Tigi.
It's Tigi, right.
And Catwalk. And what happened with Catwalk was that the marketing team were like, right, we want to put it backstage. You've got the name Catwalk belongs backstage. Would you consider going back to doing session work again? Would you do the international shows? Would you want to go out and And I'm like, creatively, I'm going, yes, 100%. But my brain's telling me, hold on a minute, I'm sitting on this side of I'm in this senior leadership team, but I'm also, so all of a sudden, my work doubled, my workload doubled.
And they do like to do that.
And they threw it all at me. And so from 2011 to 2014, when I resigned, was 3 years of an incredible journey. Lots of amazing things spawned off it. But it was also a slight downward spiral of physical and mental health, like deteriorating slowly over a period of time.
So you was doing the catwalk shows, you was in the boardroom.
So we were doing 18 shows a season, on top of my global role as creative director for Tigi. So still traveling globally, doing shows, events around the world, meetings with whatever market and flying in. Sometimes go to America 2-3 times a month, back and forth to New York. I mean, to the point where the purses on the flight, knew my first name. I mean, it was insane. It was insane.
Giving you the meal that you like.
and I drank in those days, and with my, the certain Chablis and all that stuff was all went with it. It was lovely.
Yeah.
And your car waiting for you, and all of that really lovely stuff that went with it. But when I was in it all, I wasn't realising I was unravelling. I was unravelling probably as I'm being very honest with you now. Unravelling probably as a husband. Wasn't there. I missed a lot of my daughter's early schooling, first steps, school, events, stuff that I really regret because I was away, I was travelling, I was on the road all the time. So I was pulled in two very different directions. And I'll tell you what was really interesting, and I haven't told anybody this before, I was given a coach through Unilever, this guy that was basically was somebody that would coach when people acquire companies, would take the culture from one organisation into the other and help fuse it.
Well, that's a difficult one.
And I would see him, and he would always say to me, how you are running these two things parallel is beyond my comprehension, because they are two complete different worlds. And I think the outside never knew it. I don't think Anthony knew probably the extent of what I was doing. I don't think he understood maybe the pressure that I was getting from the boardroom, the kind of intensity and you're under a microscope in that arena, and every single decision you make, the business is it has an impact on the business. So it's very, the pressure's immense. Married with
KPIs,
absolutely, all of that stuff, and understanding all of those things from gross. I mean, it's I could go through it till the cows come home. Now it's invaluable to what I do because it's really put me in a great space of what I know. But at the time of taking that in and trying to use that other part of your brain, which is creative, and being that front man, and being interviewed by the world press backstage at shows, and then doing all the show, and then doing the tests, then DJing at parties in between. It was insane. It was insanity.
Hedonistic lifestyle.
Hedonistic, staying up late, hardly any sleep, going from one event to the other. It took its toll. And I think, you know, towards the end of my time there, I think I was button heads probably with a few of the senior people, because I was being pulled creatively. That draw of being creative was way more important to me than sitting around the table with the suits. Even though I loved that.
So why was you butting heads?
Because I think they didn't, even though they were happy for me to be that person, they also expected way much more when I was in this situation. So if I couldn't make senior leadership team meetings because I was away in New York, they would say, well, cancel that fashion show. You need to be at this meeting. And you can't do that. So there was a conflict of interest, and so it became almost. And I've never spoke about this before. I'm being very, very kind of honest about it. It became almost unbearable, and thinking back on it, you know, makes me actually feel, you know, quite anxious. And there was times where, you know, I felt I was having a bit of a breakdown with it all. It was really probably drinking too much, you know, not sleeping.
So from the outside world, everyone's thinking you've got the dream
job,
and you are going through hell.
Those last 18 months, 100%, I was going through hell. There was no doubt about it.
So was it an easy decision, or was it a big decision to leave Bedhead?
I mean, probably the biggest decision I've ever had to make in my life, Lee. You know, looking back on it, and, you know, there was so much to take into consideration. You've got to think that it was my life, and I think forget the fact that Unilever owned that company at the time. It was all of the history. It was all of the sort of family thing that we've talked about, you know, with Auntie and Pat, and all the team and the people. And I knew if I was to walk away from it, that things would rapidly change overnight. And then what I meant by that would be friendships, relationships, because, you know, it would be security. And I think that was the big thing. I think, you know, we were very, very lucky. You know, we were on, you know, high salaries, and we were looked after. You know, all of those perks that went with it. You know, healthcare, dental. I mean, all of the stuff that goes with it. Amazing travel. That would be taken away, and I think so. To make that decision at the time, I think, and I have to give it to my wife, Stacey. You know, she was. This is why you know, and Stacey to this day is we're you know, 100% a unit together, and we make decisions on everything to do with work and family. But she really backed what I was going through. She understood that something had to give, and if I was to stay, things would have had to change dramatically. What they were doing with me in terms of the workload and the way that they had me positioned in the company, and I couldn't see a way out of that. I'd been exposed to the fashion thing and the session world, which I'd kind of been doing when I left Tony & Guy at the end of the 90s. And that whole feeling, that undying passion and love and obsession for the world I'm in now, was the reason to say, I'm over it, I'm doing it, and I'm ready to take on another part of my career. But it was, and you know, I had a breakdown. I had a nervous breakdown looking back on that time.
Why?
Because I think it was the shock of walking away from something which was potentially putting my family in some kind of jeopardy. With financially, it could have gone the wrong way for me. It was a gamble. It was like gambling your life away. It was like all them things that you've worked really hard for and built, you know, and you know, it's likely you have a lifestyle that goes with it. You know, you have all of the things connected to your financial outgoings and all of that stuff that's linked towards what your earnings are, and you've got to rethink everything. It's like starting again. And also for me, it was like going back to school. It was like starting all over again. Because I wasn't well known in the session world. I was well known in the professional hairdressing industry, and I had a reputation there maybe, but in the session world I was a nobody.
So did you have to take a step back to take two forward?
Absolutely. Went right back to almost to square one, and I think that was the thing for me.
And how was it when you first started? You've come out of Bedhead, like you say, with, you know, all the perks that go with it, and now you've gone into a world where, and let's face it, in Bedhead you was treated globally like a superstar, right? I mean, like a rock star. And then you've gone into a session world where you're relatively unknown. I mean, what was that like at the beginning?
It was incredibly humbling, because I think I was fortunate to work with Rankin and work with him on shoots, and you know, we can maybe talk about that in a bit. But I think what was interesting when you were being booked on jobs and working in a team of people at the time, that might have been from they were all established makeup artists, fashion stylists, photographers, and all of a sudden there's this face of somebody who's maybe a little bit older who can definitely do the hair, and that, you know, that I know I can do. But it's not about that. It's about where have you come from, how have you got to this point, who have you assisted. It's all political, and there's a game that goes with all of that. So you have to go through all of that stuff, and you know, trying to find the right agent and all of that things that go with it to try and build some kind of creative equity in the session world.
Did you ever question whether you'd made the right move?
All the time. The first, it took me a good 1.5 to 2 years of grinding, you know, feast to famine, living, you know, from month to month, paycheck to paycheck, money coming in, all the stuff that we'd saved and had on reserve, we were running out of money. It was just, and my wife was incredibly supportive all the way through it. And I think that in itself really was the sort of, probably the kind of reason that I probably got ill. You know, I got ill around about 2017. I got quite sick.
I remember.
And I got this thing with my blood, and I really looked, and I looked at everything I was doing. I thought, well, how have I got to this point? Why has this happened to me? You know, was it my lifestyle? Was it the stress? Was it all of the things? And looking back on it now that I've come through it and I'm healthier, that period, that thing of leaving, when you're asking, was it a big decision to leave? Absolutely, is all part of that. The reason that I think that actually happened at the time. So it was a life-changing decision.
Brave one. So you ended up meeting Rankin. So tell us a little bit about who Rankin is, and tell us how that relationship manifested. So
Rankin is a you know, a brand in himself. He's a very famous, iconic photographer who started an incredible, a sort of Bible, if you like, a cultural Bible for a lot of us, called Dazed and Confused. It's now just called Dazed, with a guy called Jefferson Hack in the early 90s. And they created this kind of culture, this movement, if you like, with what they were doing with Dazed at the time, and everything that was wrapped around it, not just as a magazine, but the events they were doing and exhibitions. And Rankin really, I think, built this, he's sort of into this iconic status where he wasn't just a fashion photographer. He would shoot everything from, you know, a kind of, you know, rock star to a you know, a brand like Dove, or just all of this really diverse sort of way of shooting, and an incredible creative. But we had a meeting, we met him.
Where is he on that level of photographer?
I think he's
like David Sims.
I mean, I think he's right up
that.
with all of them. I think there's a snobbery with all of that stuff, where people would disagree with me saying this, because they say, well, you know, he doesn't shoot that, and he doesn't do this. But I think when you look at what he's done and what he's achieved and where he is as a photographer and what he actually produces, his level and his incredible wide archive of, like, he can give you anything. You can go to him with you know, when we do creative treatments for him and say, well, we really like this, and he can nail it. He's got this incredible understanding of everything. Most photographers tend to stay in their kind of lane, and they have a kind of a sort of a, you know, an aesthetic to their work. He can really expand as wide as he wants to be, which is mind blowing to me. We met Rankin again through Anthony, late 90s, Tony and Guy, or midnight, I can't remember the time, but 90s, where we did a shoot. Anthony wanted to be in Dazed, so we did this. We commissioned Rankin to shoot. It was myself, Gary, Anthony, Pat, Sasha, and we did this shoot, and the pictures today still look as fresh and as clean. And we did this shoot with him, and there was a connection. Him and Anthony became super tight and super close, and we started to kind of, you know, do work with him in them days. So that was kind of how the relationship started. Over the years, he was close to Anthony, and you know, my days at the studio and Bedhead and all of that, he was around that, but it wasn't until I was thrust back into doing fashion, I then, by chance, through a fashion designer who was working on one of the early issues of Hunger magazine, which is his fashion magazine, which is his culture magazine that he has now, which he started after Dazed, that's how we'd sort of had this kind of meeting. I came back to shoot with him, and then we just hit it off again. And it was so, and our relationship has been incredibly strong and tight, and it's allowed me to sort of become, without a doubt, it's helped me achieve the things that I've got to at this point in my career.
Is it a similar kind of relationship you have with Anthony?
Well, people ask this question all the time, and the answer is 100% yes.
Yeah.
I think the thing that I had with Anthony creatively as a hairdresser, and the mentoringship that he gave to me at that stage of my life and career is very much the way that I've looked up to Rankin in what he does, and I've learned so much from him in terms of how he sort of envisions his vision is in the way that he works and thinks. So creatively, and I've learned so much. I mean, I think, you know, it's allowed you to, and I don't just work with Rankin. I mean, I think sometimes I get tarred with that brush of that because I'm the hair editor of Hunger magazine and all of the stuff that goes with it, that's all I do. I do many other things and work with lots of other photographers. How
often would you work with Rankin, percentage-wise?
I would say a large percentage, probably close to 70%.
Right.
Because, again, it's a trust thing, and I think all people that work in session tend to work in teams, and photographers like to work with people that they can trust, and I think,
and they know they're going to deliver.
And I think here at the HQ of Rankin,
which is where we are now.
Which is where we are.
This is Rankin's penthouse.
This is where
right?
my penthouse is where I worked and where I work and on a regular basis. So we felt it was fitting to shoot the interview here today. But I think because of the sort of the comfort and the trust that goes with working with him, it's a brilliant, when you go and work in other situations and it's not quite as glamorous, or the trust isn't there because you might be new to that photographer or new to that client, it's a different experience completely. And you know, we have a great scenario. I work with the beauty editor here, Marco Antonio, who's a brilliant, incredible makeup artist. So there's a tight team and everybody plays a part. Doesn't matter if you're a hairdresser or a makeup artist or you work in marketing, or everybody brings something to the table that is unique to the Rankin brand.
And tell me this, what is the main differences from being the global creative director of Bedhead to being this kind of prominent session hairdresser?
It's two completely different worlds. I think one of the things that I was always obsessed when I was in that role as creative director. I always was obsessive about what was going on in session. I wanted to be able to do hair like that. I wanted to see how could we get that hair into the hands of hairdressers. How could we influence the hairdressers' mentality, or the way that they look at hair, the way that they process hair in the salon on their clients. You know, and I talk about this a lot now, and it's come full circle for me, because now that the 8 years that I've been away from you know, in that corporate world, and being part of Bedhead and all of those things, and being purely a session stylist, if you like, has allowed me to understand the two worlds, and how do you marry them. My mission now, really, and I don't know if this is a question that you're going to ask, Lee, but my mission now is really how do we get all of that intel, all of that aesthetic and nuance and all of those details that session work allows you to do in hair, that touch, that feel, that different way of looking at things. How do we get the hairdresser to understand that way of looking at hair? Because I think once the hairdresser grabs that, will really take their work to a whole different level.
How do you get them to grab it?
Well, I think it's about brands. I think it's about brands empowering allowing, and I think it's happening. I think there's a revolution happening in hairdressing. I think there's a lot of young hair assistants that might be still connected to salons in some form of a way, that are going off to Paris and we're working on Guido's team and bringing that stuff back and influencing people in their salons. I think the brands out there, all the big brands, need to do way more of being able to take that information rather than just saying we're backstage at, Louis Vuitton, or we're doing this or we're doing that. The education element, that bits of information. I'm doing something really quite interesting at the moment with the brand that I'm working with, where all the nuances and all of the stuff that I do on a daily basis that are second nature to me is stuff that salon workers don't necessarily do. It's all those little kind of tips and little tricks and ways of working that I think if you just give that on top of somebody's hairdressing skill of cutting and blow drying and colouring and all of that brilliant stuff that we do in the salon, and then you give them that extra element to their work, I think it will elevate the standard of hair. How
does someone make it in session? And number two, how do you get as big as the Guidos, the Eugenes, the Duffys? I think so. First of all, how does somebody make it in session? I think you have to. It goes back to me talking about try and get to be with somebody you really look up to. Try and get onto that team. Try and be part of, first of all, assisting. Who is it? If it's a Guido, if it's a Eugene, if it's a Duffy, if it's you want to work with somebody like myself, whoever it might. How do you get into the Nick Irwin team? Well, a young person watching this now from the north of England, how do they get onto Nick Irwin's team? I mean, DM me on Instagram. And we've just done a thing now where we're actually now looking for a new assistant. And we go through this, every couple of years. And I think it's a really important time and I think now with the power of things like Instagram where people can just DM you straight away. I mean, you said the same thing. It's how you got hold of Guido. Just DM'd him. You DM'd him and he comes straight back to you. And I respond quicker to that than I do anything. And how good do they have to be? Well, I'm a firm believer. For me, it's not about skill set at the beginning. I don't care about any of that stuff. It's about the mentality. It's about your mindset. If you're obsessive and that you're disciplined and that you're prepared to go through, and believe me, it's not like going through your apprenticeship in a salon where it can be, it's tough, but it's kind of easy. It's straightforward. The hours, the lack of money at the beginning, all of that stuff that go with session work are brutal. And it's a whole different arena and a whole different. But if you're prepared to give everything up for that and to show that you are loyal and driven and focused and good attitude, and also my team, my assistants, people that work with me are as important. We critique. People are quite freaked out when they work with me because everybody is asked their opinion on what we're working on as we're doing it. I'm never. I don't create the hair and go, well, that's it. It's important that I get their vision. Because they're young. They're in a different sort of way of looking at hair and what's going on out there. And I need to get that perception brought into what we're doing. So that's a really, really valuable point of what I look for in a hairdresser. Skill, is important if somebody's really good. I think they have to obviously learn all the fundamentals. Now, the big thing right now in hairdressing that everybody should now go out there and practice and learn. You should be able to braid. You should be able to braid, and you should be learning how to do afro and textured hair. Because for years we've shunned it and we've just let a whole different community look after it. Not perming though. Not perming. Not perming. Even though perm is making a comeback, I believe, but it's not something that. I've been saying that for 30 years, I know. That's bizarre. But I do believe that skill set that's been a part of that culture in that world for so many years is so heavily influencing what we're doing in the session world, and is very much part of it. And I think this whole thing with inclusivity and diversity, from campaigns to the work that we're creating is invaluable. So I think that's an amazing piece of advice for people. If you learn that stuff, and I was blessed that we were taught it early on. But there are a lot of people that come to me that they can do all the other stuff, but when it comes to that, and you can learn that on bloody YouTube. You can learn it on YouTube, and everything's there. It's on your iPhone. It's all there for you. And I think there's so many brilliant people out there that are teaching it as well. So I think that's a really great bit of advice. To get the second part of your question, how do you get to that level? I think a lot of it is
I think it's much harder now than it's ever been. I think you've got to remember when Guido sort of was coming up the ranks, and Eugene, there was a handful of them that were doing it, and they were mixing in those circles. Then it was a very, it was a sort of it was like a golden triangle, if you like, of art directors and editors, and it was all very incestuous, and everybody was working with each other, and they all became teams, photographers, makeup artists, and which was a really special time. That still goes on. If you look at the likes of Duffy, who's really over the last, and I'm a massive fan of what he does, over the last sort of 10 years, especially his rise and how he's gone from doing the level of session work he was doing into the big arena, from the Louis Vuitton, Givenchy, Rick Owens, all of these incredible shows, is phenomenal. But I think a lot of it is taste. I think it's how you are, how you sort of commend yourself in that arena. Relationships. Also, confidence is super important. I don't think you have to be flashy and overconfident, but I think you have to have a hidden belief and a drive inside you that comes across when you're mixing with that level of people. And I think just that pure dedication. I think I told you off camera that I'm always dialed in. I only come out of this sort of headspace to be a father when I'm around my daughter and be a husband to my wife. But I don't sit at home and watch soaps, or I'm not a TV. I'm dialed into what I'm doing 24/7. You have to be to try and do the best work you can possibly do. And believe me, all of those successful guys, the Eugenes,
they live and breathe it.
It's their life. It's their absolute life, and they live by the sword and they die by the sword, and they don't do anything else. And it's a 24/7 thing. And if you're up for doing all of that, and that's the levels that you want to get to, then that's where you need to. That would be my advice.
Do you ever suffer with imposter syndrome?
All the time, and me and you have talked about this a million times. And I always remember you telling me a brilliant thing of wanting to come out to I'm the Great Pretender. I don't know if you remember telling me this story when I think we were in Australia. I don't know if you remember Anthony, the guy Anthony, what's his name at the time, was going to get me and you to do that thing together, the two British. Can you remember that?
Yeah, vaguely. Yeah.
But the point I'm trying to make is when we talk about this time, I always feel like an imposter, and I'll tell you why. I think that young 14-year-old northern kid that comes from a very humble background, a working class background, I still feel that I am that kid. And sometimes when I'm in these arenas, when I'm working with some of my celebrity clients, or I'm shooting a Rolls-Royce campaign with Rankin, or I'm on a set of something that's just, you have to pinch yourself moment, I think, do I belong here? And I question what I'm doing. And I think I've came into session work, what I'm doing, at a slightly different angle to a lot of other people. So there's a pecking order in session world. So I often think, I wonder what the other session workers think of me. So there's that paranoia. So if that's kind of imposter syndrome as well.
Yeah. When do you feel most under pressure?
I feel most under pressure, I think, when I am just about to bring a look that I've created from the glam room onto a set, if that makes makes sense. That moment of, is what I've done going to work for the situation I'm in? Because it's a bit like when you pick the mirror up to show the client the hair. Are they going to like it? Are they going to? And I think that's when I feel the pressure. I deal with pressure in other areas because of my career and because of what I've been through and the journey I've been on. I'd like to think I take things in my stride very easily. I'm very confident in a lot of those arenas where people will probably feel physically sick. Getting on a stage and talking to a large number of people doesn't faze me one bit. Being in an environment where I'm with a top photographer and I'm behind a camera and I might have somebody from a major magazine or a creative industry, agency telling me that it's not great and the hair's not right and you haven't really hit the brief, and that's the worst thing.
Does that happen often?
Sometimes, but very.
And how do you deal with it?
You have to suck it up, and I think and that's what humbles you about being a session stylist. That's why, again, you should never get into this if you're not good at being critiqued or take criticism.
And what's the biggest mistake you think you've made in your career?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I think there's a lot of people would answer that for me. I think there's certain things that I've turned down, which I could potentially regret.
Like what?
I think that a role came up not so long ago with a brand. The money was pretty life changing, but I shunned it.
Is money important to you now?
I think money isn't everything. One thing I learned after leaving Unilever and Tigi and the money I was earning in them days to what we're doing now is a different type of. You earn in a very different way now, and I think it's comparisons are there, but the money comes in different ways. It's not like a regular thing. So money is important because it gives you choice, gives you freedom, it helps you, gives you security with your family. But I'm a much more humbler person. The things that went with the lifestyle of those days. I mean, yes, we all like to travel nicely, and we all nice holidays and all of that stuff
nice
that goes
clothes.
with it, and nice clothes and all of the things, and maybe a nice watch and all of that materialistic garbage. But I think ultimately being content with who you are and being happy with who you are as a person is way more important, and being in tune with who you are, and I think that's way more important than being, than money.
And what are you obsessed with right now?
Wow, there's a lot of things on the go. I mean, anybody who knows me musically, I'm so obsessed with music. It's funny because I've got this Prince sort of thing that I've had since the 80s. I've always been a huge Prince fan, and I've rediscovered, I'm going down this rabbit hole at the moment of just rediscovering all of the Prince stuff. I've got a lot of his, I'm an avid record collector. I've got a ton of records. Vinyl. And which a lot of the young people watching probably think, what is that? Which my daughter's getting into actually, which is really interesting, and she's starting to show an interest in it. So that's become an obsession. But I think it depends on. I get obsessed in the moment of what I'm working on. If I've got a project that's about to come to fruition, then I really throw everything at it.
So you're about the moment.
I'm always about the moment, and I very much. I have a thing. And I nicked this from somebody years ago, but I have a creative orphanage. I have lots of things that I cook to a certain point. I get to a certain level of what I'm doing, and then I park it, and I think I'll hold it there till the right situation comes along. So I'm always working on things that I've got to, but I tend to put things in boxes so I can give it my 100% focus and vision in that moment.
John Frieda said a very, very similar thing. What hair brands are slaying it at the moment?
What hair brands are?
Slaying it. Crushing it.
Wow. I mean, this is a really interesting one because I think it depends on which way you look at it. I think you've got to admire what R&Co have done. I think they've done a great job.
What, the Scottish brand?
No, R&Co, which is, do you not know who R&Co are? R&Co?
Yeah, R&Co. Isn't that a Scottish brand?
No, well, what's his name? But it's Garen and what's his name that used to be with Bumble? Howard.
Right.
But they're based out of America.
Right.
So I think they're doing, and I've got some friends who work for them, I think they're doing great stuff in terms of, you're talking about hair brands, right? Yeah. We're talking about hair brands. I think there's lots of young little independent brands out there that are doing great. I think, I'm working with a brand, I'm working with Schwarzkopf. We're doing some really interesting stuff on a big scale, on a big level, and I think there's massive change. I think there's a revolution happening in hairdressing. I think there's lots of things that are going on at the moment that brands need to be embracing, that need to understand that it's a very different culture out there and a different market, and that old mentality of the way of looking at things. Me and you have had this conversation a million times.
About
diversity and exclusivity and really talking to the hairdresser for what they are, not building this facade around what hairdressing used to be or should be. Is dealing with how it is in this given time, in this present moment, and I think that's why we're having issues attracting young people to the table.
What 3 hair products can Nick Irwin not live without?
Hairspray.
Any particular one?
Well, I've got to say a hairspray that I've just worked on. There's a new it was a brand I've just worked on, but I've just been working on a new hairspray called Session Label with Schwarzkopf, which is called the Strong. It's a stronger spray. Normally, I would use things like Elnet and all of these other things that that all session workers use, which are incredible, the kind of fine mist. But sometimes you need a stronger spray which can leave a residue on the hair. And I love that because now we've found this formula, this spray that just is absolutely brilliant. So I don't know if I can say that on camera, but I really love that spray. Not a hair product, but a product that I can't live without, which I use all the time, and it's the biggest trick for me anyway in session work is water. A water spray is using water to make the hair look a certain nuance or a texture or a finish. And
anything in the water?
Sometimes we might put some kind of a protein spray in there to kind of relax sometimes, if you overcook a blow dry or a hairstyle that you just want it to, a little bit of its natural nuance to come back into it, the life come back in, a fine mist over the surface and let the whole thing just start to come back and be a bit more real again. I think you can kill hair too much, and I do it, we all do it. We put too much heat on it, we overcook it, and when I'm doing session,
brings it back a bit.
Brings it back. It's a great tip, and I do it a lot on sets. And it's a great one, even in your clients in the salon. If you've overdone it, and 9 times out of 10 you will do, because you're really trying to work it and overdo it. A little bit of a water spray or a protein spray or anything that's just going to put a mist that will just help settle the natural elasticity in the hair, bring it down a little bit, and it just makes it feel a bit real and a bit more lived in again. That's a really lovely little technique for people to use.
What would you say to someone that is thinking of a career in hair?
I think, and this is again, and I know there's a lot of controversy about young people going into hairdressing at the moment. To me, it's a no-brainer, because I think if you have the right attitude and you really want to be part of something which can be life-changing for you and give you all of the. I've never worked a day in my life. I always say this to people. I think we have things that are days that are incredibly tough, but I've never ever looked at hairdressing as a job.
No, I haven't either.
And I think we've had this conversation. We share the same ethos on this stuff, Lee. And I think I would always say that to young people coming into hairdressing. It's once you buy into it, and if you really believe in it, it will never feel like it's a job to you.
And what one bit of advice would you give to a student that is struggling with learning right now?
I mean, that's a really tough question. Let me think about that one. I think the thing for me that if a student's really struggling with learning right now, I think you just need to be present in what and read. The biggest regret, you asked about my regrets I have earlier, the biggest regret I had, and I still struggle with it, is learning to listen. Learning to listen and to be present in one, and I think because of what's going on in the world, because we are so programmed into things so fast and listen to music really quickly and fast forwarding and Instagram and scrolling and all of that, it's very difficult to stay dialed in. And I think a young hairdresser that's struggling with learning needs to just try and look at how they focus on things, look at all of the other things that's probably stopping them from learning. And I if you cut some of the things out, or maybe pull back on some of that stuff, like we do as a parent with a child.
John Frieda said exactly the same thing, didn't he? He said exactly the same thing.
I think that's where you should potentially.
Nothing changes, does it? It's like all these old school habits, isn't it? I mean, like you say though, today it's even more relevant because of everything you've just said.
It is, and I think that's the thing. And I'm a big purveyor of technology and what's going on and embracing. We've just done a whole issue recently that's wrapped around the metaverse, which is a whole different thing that's happening out there. And that's something that I think we need to embrace moving forward. It's a whole other conversation. Collaborating with each other. We need to learn as hairdressers are looking at what fashion designers are doing and what other brands coming together. Big brands would never think of coming together on each other because it's too competitive. They don't realise actually if they do something together, they could unlock something and really take what we're doing as an industry to a whole different level. That I would really encourage as moving forward. So they're the things I think. It's time. It's time. something needs to happen in hair. That it's time for. I don't know what the zeitgeist. I don't have the zeitgeist of what that is, but I feel connected to where we should be going.
Where do you think it's headed?
I think it's heading to all of the things that I've just said there about collaboration. I think we need to really. I think there's a whole different perspective. I think the models of things that we think are the model of the way things should work, like a salon situation, has to change. We have to maneuver with that. We have to be aware of what the next generations are demanding, and the way that they're communicating, the way that they speak to us, how they want to learn. So we need to listen to how they want to learn. We need to be adjust to that. There's no point just saying to a kid, "Well, that's not how you do it." You need to be. This is, you need to learn that, and that, and we have, as teachers, have to find a way of working around that and looking at how we can adjust to fit those kids, not just look at the kids being the issue. I think that's a really important time. I think once we look all of that stuff, it'll empower the hairdresser, empower the future of hairdressing, and it'll make brands really understand where we need to go moving forward.
How could a salon collaborate more?
Well, one of the things that I'm doing, and I know I've spoken to you about this, Lee, before with my role. I had this vision coming in as hair editor at Hunger, was to say, how do we take salon hairdressers or brands from the professional salons from the hairdressing industry that might be connected to a brand or whatever. How do I then give them an opportunity to be in the magazine, to shoot an editorial? Can we get some sponsorship from a brand that they're connected to, whether it be a L'Oreal or a Schwarzkopf or a Weller or Lee Stafford or whoever it is, and give them 6-8 page story and really showcase them in a whole different way of working and collaborate in that way. That's one of the things, and give them a new platform, an opportunity where they probably never, unless there was session work, has never been given to be in a magazine like Hunger. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to do. I'm also, I'm very much part of the Fellowship of Hairdressing, because I really believe in the heritage of what hairdressing stands for. I think sometimes people have a perception of, say, the Fellowship being an old boys club and all of that kind of stuff. But I feel that unless we're part of we need to be the change we want things to be. So collaborating in those areas and bringing people together for me is super, super important.
And are you optimistic about the future of British hairdressing?
I think we're going to go through we're going through a very tough phase at the moment, which and I have to be, this is controversial, because I think I've got a feel for a lot of salon owners that are going through this real struggle post the pandemic. I just heard about Nicky Clark's, shutting his shop down, and these institutions that were so influential to us. It's heartbreaking because for whatever reason. But we have to understand why these people don't want to come back to the salon, why they don't want to work in the system that we've currently got set up. And until we embrace that way of looking at things, then we can find the solution, and that'll bring us out of this.
So if Nick Irwin was president of British hairdressing, what one thing would you change to future-proof the industry?
God, that is a really tough question. I think, and I've got to be really careful because...
Don't be careful, Nick.
I think the competition way of doing things has really, there's a formula that actually is so disconnected to what really is happening in the hair. I think that will change the game. I think if we really look at that hair that exists in that world, and why are we doing that stuff? Why are we creating that hair? Who are we creating it for? Are we creating it for us? Is it for our ego? Is it because we want to get up and hold that trophy? Or are we creating it on a much sort of more profound level, where we're really showcasing what hair should be for a global audience, like from the consumer right through to the professional? If we can achieve that, or if I could achieve that, if I was that president of British hairdressing, that would be what I want to do.
What would you change in the competition? What rule would you put in there to change it?
I would take all rules out of it. I think it would be purely about people putting something in front. And one of the main things that really I work on a lot when I do what I do at Hunger Magazine, and what part of our sort of manifesto, if you like, is retouching, is the art of retouching. For the competitions now, hairdressing competitions around the world have become so heavily retouched. I know people say, it hasn't been, but it's a retouching. A lot of it's retouching. I think you've got to take that away from it. And I think also that you really need to look at, the rules that, you can't use this, you can't use a wig, you can't do that, you can't. I think you should just let people do, because the creativity is in the way that you're doing the hair. And I think if you put that at the forefront of it all, it will change the game.
Like that. Do you think students leaving college in this country hit the industry ready? Or in your experience, do they have to go back into the salons to retrain?
I think, sadly, I have to say they have to go back into the salons and retrain a little bit. And I don't quite understand why that works. I'm not sure that. I don't know enough about it. I know you're the expert here, Lee, with that stuff, but I know through past experience that when we would get people fresh from colleges and certain situations like that, there would be a lot of retraining, having to sort of go back to the drawing table a little bit in certain areas. I think it's interesting because when I was at college, and the things that I learnt in them days, Marcel waving, pin curling, is all the stuff that I'm now so blessed that I learned. Because I can do it. I can braid, I can do all of them things that I was taught at that early age. But I think we went through a phase where we got rid of that stuff, and I think, the power of straightening irons and tongs and tools and the discipline in styling and doing all of those other things kind of went out the window. So I think that fused with maybe the lack of the right teachers that are training these people in those organisations. And I don't want to put anybody down, because it's not necessarily everybody's fault. It's just sometimes it's the curriculum of the way that it's led and the way that it's done. But sadly, I think it does need to sort of, it needs to change.
And tell me this, I mean, in your early years, you obviously copied hair that you liked and you copied your mentors. Why are you so obsessed with not copying the people you look up to today?
Well, I created something today.
Yeah.
I always have, when I ever do anything, I put words on a sheet that I always try and remember because it's important. And I have a thing that I always talk about: eyes first, hands second. So it's always about looking at something before you physically touch. And I think it's the same thing when you get inspired by other people's work. I think there's nothing worse when I go and judge the British or creative head, or look at a head of hair that I think, Eugene's done that last season, and they've literally taken it from that. If somebody takes it and changes it and alters it and flips it on its head and does it, I can see the influence, but I think, wow, that's clever. You can't get ideas from the future because it hasn't happened yet. You have to look at the past to inspire you. You have to look at what's come from before. You have to reference and archive and go down all of these kind of rabbit holes to find out and be influenced by what other people have done before you. But always try and put your own stamp on it. What I've tried to do, and hopefully I've done with my work, is that you, hopefully when you look at the hair, you kind of think, I think Nick's done that. I think that's the dream for all session hairdressers. And I think if you can do that as a hairstylist, if you can really be inspired by a Guido or an Anthony or a Lee Stafford or whoever it might be, but look how you can then flip it, how you can take elements of it and then make it your own.
Is there anything left that Nick Irwin wants to achieve?
Yeah, there is, and I think I want to change the game in hairdressing. I think we need to change the perception of the way hairdressing is seen in the consumer's eyes. I think, and certainly being on both sides of the fence, there's a snobbery with the fashion world that looks at hairdressing. They see it as being a little bit old-fashioned and a little bit not as current and not as up, which I disagree with wholeheartedly. But I also understand some of the work that the professional hairdressing industry turns out can look dated. For instance, if I was to do some of those looks on a set with Rankin, I would be fired. I would be kicked off the set. I've got to make people look real. So I think it goes back to me wanting to. I'd love to be able to change. Excuse me. I would love to. I think the game needs to be changed in the way that the perception that we have of hair, and that's something that I really work towards.
Where do you see yourself in 10 years' time?
Well, in lockdown, I turned 50. The first when lockdown first happened, and I had this epiphany that, we're working really hard, and where do we want to be? And I said to my wife that, I would love to eventually, once I've hopefully achieved all the things I want to do in hair, is buy a humble finca, do it up in the north of Ibiza, and have a load of dogs and become a bit of a hippie and just enjoy the rest of my life.
Great.
That's my personal goal.
Not a bad
That's where
goal,
I'd love
is
to
it,
be
mate?
in
It's not
10
a bad
years'
goal,
time.
is it? And when you look back on your career, what are you most proud of?
That's a really tricky question, because I think I'm proud of lots of things that I've achieved throughout the years. This standout moments in my career. Something happened last year, which I never really looked at it that it was going to do that to me. I opened up the British Hairdressing Awards show with a sort of a shoot which I'd done for the 10th anniversary of Hunger. I brought it to life. It was a gamble. We used all black models and did this incredible story and got an amazing ovation for it, and the adulation after it was phenomenal, and that really humbled me. So that was a real, in terms of things that have happened recently, that really hit me, and that was a special one.
And when you're in Ibiza with your dogs, how do you want people to remember you?
I would like people. I have this thing of wanting to be a bit of a game changer. I'd love people to say he changed the game, and I think that hasn't happened yet, and I'm still working towards that. So, if that or that would end up on my gravestone, then that would make me a very happy person.
Nick Irwin, game changer. And what never fails to make Nick Irwin emotional these days?
My family, my daughter. Without a doubt, and every day you look at her and you see what you've created and you feel blessed, and that hands down is what makes me emotional.
Okay, I've got some quick fire questions now. First thing that comes into your head: Marmite, love it or hate it?
Hate it.
Shower or bath?
Shower.
Night in, night out?
Night in.
Global creative director of Supreme or Yeezy?
Global creative director of Yeezy.
Hair up, hair down?
Hair down.
Netflix or YouTube?
YouTube.
Apple or Android?
Apple.
Sweet or savoury?
Savoury.
Dress up or dress down?
Dress down.
Lee Stafford or Nicky Clark?
Lee Stafford.
It's been a pleasure, Nick Irwin.
Thank you very much, I've loved it.
It's a wrap.